Jordan Mechner was fueled by a dream to create the ultimate lifelike video game character. So he created a masterpiece all on his own, the Prince of Persia. Not only did it reshape gaming in the early 90s, but left an enduring mark on the entire industry. But after one successful sequel and two failures, Mechner decided to step away from game development forever. Now enter Yannis Mallet. His desire was to resurrect the Prince after Ubisoft acquired Mechner's production company Broderbund. The only issue was Mallet needed Mechner's approval, so he assembled a team of 7 inexperienced game developers with the hope of winning Mechner over. And they did. This is a journey through the captivating story of Prince of Persia and the Sands of Time, where we witness the determination of a small but mighty team, and the events that some believe led to the downfall of Ubisoft. In 1979, during his high school years, Jordan Mechner received his first computer, a groundbreaking Apple II. Little did he know that this piece of technology would not only save him countless quarters at the arcade, but also ignite his curiosity in video game creation. He would immerse himself in the world of computer programming. Mechner subscribed to magazines like Creative Computing and Soft Talk. These magazines offered articles that served as his guides in teaching himself the intricate art of coding. When he got to college, Mechner wanted to use his coding skills to create a video game with a story, unlike the high-score-focused games around him. His vision materialized in the form of Karateka, a pioneering karate fighting game that distinguished itself by weaving a narrative into the gaming experience. Unlike its counterparts, Karateka's objective was to embark on a quest to save a princess from the clutches of an evil warlord, requiring players to conquer multiple karate fights along the way. But what set Karateka apart wasn't solely its narrative. Mechner recognized his limitations as an animator, and he had to employ a highly creative yet labor-intensive technique known as rotoscoping. He initially filmed his mom's karate instructor executing kicks, punches, and blocks, using Super 8 film, but somehow that film got lost, and Mechner had to re-record every move featuring his own parents. After getting the film, Mechner meticulously traced each third frame of the film using tracing paper and a pencil, pixel by pixel. This brought the characters to life at a rate of 6 frames per second. This intricate and time-consuming process took months, marking the dedication and passion that fueled the creation of Karateka, a game that not only defied gaming norms at the time, but also showcased the extraordinary lengths Mechner went to realize his vision. After finding success with Karateka and graduating college, Mechner faced a critical crossroad: create another video game, or become a screenwriter and make movies. One of Mechner's idols was Chris Columbus, the writer of Goonies and Gremlins, and Mechner really wanted that lifestyle. And he believed that making another game could waste his time, as he believed that PC gaming could die off by the time he finished his second game in the late 80s. But Mechner took the plunge anyways, and after a few months of negotiations, got Broderbund back on board to produce his new IP. That was inspired by the first 10 minutes of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The visceral excitement of seeing Indy running, jumping over a pit, barely hanging onto the ledge with his fingertips, and rolling under the gate before closing was the very thing Mechner wanted to have in his game. He did notice that the games being released around him almost had something like this. But if a player made a mistake, the character would slowly float to the bottom and receive no damage, which created no sense of danger. And this was something that Mechner wanted to change for his game, because he wanted players to feel the danger of mistiming a jump and falling to their death, or at the very least, be able to grab the ledge and pull themselves up. Mechner found other inspirations for his game from his own production studio, Broderbund. One of them was the Castle of Dr. Creep. Its gameplay included pressure plates and traps that Mechner found very interesting. The other game, Lode Runner, was especially an inspiration for his modular level design, and of course his own game, Karateka, inspired him. This brought Mechner's ultimate design goal to combine the basic platform gameplay with a modular environment with very smooth visceral running and jumping animations that would capture the excitement of the first 10 minutes of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The big problem though was he was still developing on the Apple II, which only had 4 colors, a screen of 280 by 192 pixels, and the biggest hurdle, everything had to fit on 48K of memory, the size of a text email. The first thing Mechner wanted to get started on was the modular level creator, so he could quickly build and playtest his levels. This took Mechner over a month to create, but with it done, he began creating and linking the pressure plates with the gates. He had an idea to use a moving wall within the game, but he figured it would be too difficult to pull off. But as fate would have it, a couple of months into development, Mechner actually left his game to attempt his other dream, creating a movie. Mechner had also written a screenplay after he finished college, a thriller about a kid who was into cave exploring. He had given it to some friends around the time he'd finished it, and it somehow got to an agent from Hollywood, and they wanted to create a movie. Mechner, being more excited at a movie prospect, flew to LA, and within 10 days he had an agent, a producer, Lawrence Turman of John Carpenter's A Thing, and director Curtis Hanson. But as Mechner would find out, making a movie is a very long process, even longer than a game design, And after 8 months, Mechner realized the movie had been going nowhere, so he left and went back to start developing his game again. As expected, the Apple II didn't allow Mechner to create the lifelike quality character that he wanted with programming, so he had to go back to his rotoscoping ability. But now there was a new technology that released in 1985 he could make use of, the VHS. But VHS players at the time in 1985 cost $2,500, so Mechner had to get his first credit card, but smartly chose one that had a 30-day money-back guarantee on all purchases. "I bought the camera, shot the footage, and immediately mailed it back," Mechner told the GDC panel. As Mechner needed someone with athletic ability, his younger brother offered his athleticism for the example footage at a high school parking lot. But using the new VHS technology caused problems for Mechner. He wasn't sure how to get the videotape frames into the computer. The answer came from a very tedious process of analog to digital work. Mechner took the VHS and played it on a TV screen in a dark room, put a 35mm camera on a tripod and aimed it at the TV screen, and took a picture, frame by frame. He then took all those images to get developed at a 1-hour photo, which gave him back all the snapshots. He then taped all those together and used Sharpie and whiteout and highlighted the outline of his brother's movements. Then he put those on a Xerox machine to create a one sheet of white character on a black background. So the contrast was sharp enough to have the paper on an animation stand with a camera pointed at it, to run into the Apple II, which at the time didn't even have a video in input. Mechner had to buy and use a special digitizer card that could get one clean still image and not motion. So Mechner had to cut each image pixel by pixel and cut them out using his animation tool to create the movement in the game. This process only took weeks instead of months, but the results were miraculous and Mechner was able to create the lifelike hero he had been envisioning in his head. But his excitement would be short-lived as each animation took up a series of bytes to accomplish, and by the time all the animations of the prince were in, Mechner had used up most of the Apple II memory, and he still needed to add all of the other images, the game logic, the background, and music into the game. At this point, it had been 2 years since the beginning of development, and Mechner did figure out the memory issue, but all he had was a smooth-running character in a dungeon with pressure plates and spike traps. The game had not achieved his goal. It wasn't fun to play. Luckily, Mechner had 2 colleagues working in the same office as him. One was Tommy Pierce, and the other was Robert Cook. Every time Mechner showed Tommy a new feature he had added like jaw traps or torches on the wall, she would just walk by and say, "Combat, combat, combat." And this drove Mechner crazy. For him, Prince of Persia was a non-violent puzzle game, and he never intended to add combat, and even if he wanted to, he was bound by the constraints of the Apple II, and he didn't have enough memory to add another character. But then Tommy asked Mechner this question: "Couldn't you make him a different color? Say, black?" This is when it hit Mechner. He was using the Apple II, and there was a function called the exclusive OR. And this shifted each bit over and created a shimmery, ghostly outline of the character. And Shadow Man was born. It took Mechner all but 2 minutes to code the Shadow Man into the entire game. It was like he was always there. Robert was the one who suggested Shadow Man came into being when the player jumped through the mirror, and he becomes your enemy. Mechner created scripted moments in the game to make players hate Shadow Man, like when he stole potions or reset players' progress. All of this was done so in the final duel you really wanted to beat him, which created the emotional connection and challenge Mechner was looking for. Mechner soon found another 12K of memory hiding in the auxiliary memory port. He used this to populate the dungeon with guards and rotoscoped a 6-second clip of the 1938 Robin Hood fight with Basil Rathbone for the combat in the game. In a period of a few weeks and months fairly close to the end of development, he slapped a story of saving a princess, cut the game from 50 levels to 10, radically changing the design of all the levels, the pacing of the game and the rhythm, the balance of action, exploration, and puzzle solving. He found the fun and balance that made Prince of Persia what it was. The game was complete and now had challenge, fear, and suspense. Everything that made Karateka successful. The only issue was, the Apple II platform had died in 1988, before he finished. Prince of Persia was released in October of 1989, and sold 84 copies for the Apple II, as stores didn't want to carry an obsolete game. Then Prince of Persia was ported to PC in May of 1990, where it also didn't sell well, and was delisted in all formats. But the 101 Night-inspired game would be saved by 3 things. A programmer who kept remaking the game for every Mac that had been coming out, creating a market for the game. They then redid the box art for the game, making it more up-to-date, and then they got a foreign license. This combination of factors led to Prince of Persia selling over 2 million copies in 1992, saving the game, making Prince of Persia the first cinematic platformer, and perhaps the most influential. Mechner saw success in his sequel Prince of Persia 2, The Shadow and Flame in 1993, but after this he would experience 2 failures. One was a point-and-click game based on the Orient Express, that when the marketing team collapsed due to internal problems and the partner companies pulled out, cost his studio $6 million. The second was Prince of Persia 3D, a project he was only a creative consultant on because Mindscape was developing the game. But during Prince of Persia 3D's development, the learning company bought out Broderbund and 500 employees were laid off in the first month, and Red Orb Entertainment took over as developers. Mechner and the OG Prince of Persia team survived the cuts, but they had a short time to complete the game. And when it was released in 1999, 6 years after Prince of Persia 2, it was a horrible Tomb Raider copycat with tons of bugs, pushing Mechner to retire from game creation indefinitely. Or so he thought. Mattel would come and buy the learning company, selling their assets for profit to a small French game company, Ubisoft. Ubisoft at this time was very small. In fact, the studio was really only known for their 1996 classic Rayman, and their new branch Ubisoft Montreal was only creating low-profile children's games. The acquisition of the learning company's assets, though, gave Ubisoft the ownership of the previous Prince of Persia games, and only caught the eye of one Ubisoft producer, Yannis Mallet. Mallet had been busy helping produce the Game Boy Advance port of Rayman that finished in 2001. And he was one of the only producers who wasn't working on Montreal's brand new IP, Splinter Cell. With the freedom of not having a project, Mallet turned to the Prince. The only issue? He needed the approval of the man who owned the rights, Jordan Mechner. To even entertain this idea and not have another failed Prince of Persia project, Mechner needed to meet the team. I needed to judge if the team was going to be able to do a good game, Mechner recalls. So Mallet quickly secured some resources and put together a small team to create some test animations and mocap to demonstrate to Mechner. Mallet soon realized that their work wasn't good enough. The designers on the project were coming up with a very basic game. You know, you run around in 3D, there are traps, and it was all very obvious, Mallet told IGN. It was the old school way of game design where the designer uses only one tool, Microsoft Word. Typing, that's all they do. It was all just words on a page. I didn't want a 300-page design document. I wanted something more alive. We needed designers who could think about the animation and the style of the gameplay. We needed innovation, Mallet recalled. And with that, he fired the entire first team and put a fresh team of very young developers together, a few weeks before Mechner arrived. The other employees took notice in Ubisoft and quickly dismissed the Prince of Persia game completely. People from other projects would walk by the team and say, "Hey, that's Prince of Persia. It's going nowhere. It's a dead franchise," recalls Felipe Morin, the game's camera designer, who was also the oldest member of the team at 31. But for Mallet, this was the right decision. Him and the new team came up with the Persian ninja concept and completely blew Mechner away with the crude test animations of the very acrobatic prince, who could now run up walls. The preconception team imagined a prince who would perform moves right out of a movie, like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and perhaps the most exciting idea was what the team called vertical walling, the ability for the prince to run up the side of walls, just like in The Matrix, Mallet remembers. This blew Mechner away. I absolutely did not want to hear about making another Tomb Raider clone. The masterstroke was taking my running and jumping animations from the first game and expanding that vertically so you could run up walls. After the animation test concluded, Mechner addressed the team directly, making eye contact with each member, expressing one thing: "Guys, what I've just seen has reawakened the joy of making video games to me." Not long after, Ubisoft and Mechner struck a deal for Mallet's team to begin development of the new Prince of Persia game. Mallet was really only the producer for the game, and the real leader of the group was creative director Patrice Desilets, who had just finished creating the game Disney's Donald Duck Going Quackers. Desilets was different in his work approach because at night he was an improv comedian, and he used his improv skills in video game creation. In a way, improv inspires the way I design a game. In improv, you have to say yes to a lot of what people give you because if you say no, the improv is over. Game design is a lot like that for me. I try to say yes to everyone's ideas and build off of them. I would never sit here and say, "Well, that's a good idea, but the design document I wrote back in February says this, so we can't change it," Desilets told GameSpot. Desilets had no issue coming up with his core game design mechanics for Prince of Persia, even if they sounded a little out of place. I love how games like NHL have great context-sensitive control, so I wanted to blend the mechanics of a sports game with a story-driven adventure, Desilets explained. In the early days, I thought of this as an action-adventure game like Tony Hawk, only with a prince. I wanted a character you could throw around the environment and he would do acrobatic tricks. Our prince was going to be about a set of possibilities rather than specific abilities. So as you played the game, you were going to surprise yourself with what the character could do in certain environments. It was decided that the game would use the Beyond Good and Evil Jade engine, which allowed the team to preserve the magic of the original, but also let the team create new exciting innovations for the current generation of consoles. And although they did not have an art director at this time, these new innovations helped create the perfect environment for the prince. We developed a fabric system that allowed performers to drape in the player's path to drop, which gives a very atmospheric feeling, and a glow effect that gives the textures and light effects a magical touch, Mechner recalls. This tech fit perfectly with the team's design focus of making the in-game levels have exaggerated proportions to feel more immersive and mysterious. In order to build the complicated levels that allowed the prince to show off his acrobatics, the team went through a series of blueprint sessions. Those designs were literally done from 30,000 feet in the air, explains DeSoleil. We look at the top-down view of the level and say, okay, over here there'll be a fight, and then over here there'll be some acrobatic gameplay with columns. By the time the sessions were done, the team had over 250 rough created rooms that would go into production. The environment was also created to be immersive and dynamic. We wanted to create a dynamic environment in which a player would evolve, so the prince's clothes and hair react dynamically to his movements and surroundings. And a wind simulation system affects characters, drapes, bridges, etc., lead engineer Claude Longuet recalled. With Prince of Persia's 3D's horrible camera on Mechner's mind, the Ubisoft team worked hard to develop something cinematic and intuitive. 3 concepts drove camera development: liberty, transparency, and aesthetic. In terms of liberty, the player can completely control the camera with the right joystick, although we do provide some camera path in each room. Transparency results from well-designed locations along with each of these predetermined paths. Aesthetic comes from a pretty cool idea that we call an alternative cam. It's another camera that a player can access at will that delivers a different look at any given location, with an emphasis on visual quality. And the fighting cam that we developed provides a very Hong Kong movie feel to the in-game battles, DeSoleil explains. To complete the total immersion for players, the team also developed a transparent dynamic loading system. We also developed a dynamic loading system that there are no interruptions in the rhythm of the game. It gives a real sense of being right there in the middle of the apocalypse, DeSoleil told Game Reactor. The animator started with a paper sketch of the prince. Then the Jade engine made it really easy for them to create the 3D skeleton and finally layer the polygon mesh and textures. There were 2 main principles that made this movement perfect: strong posing, which conveyed clearly what the character was doing, and follow through, which is the way that the animation ends and the way that they staggered the movement through different parts of the body. Being influenced by martial art movies such as Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, Once Upon a Time in China, and The One, led to the creation to many original fighting moves that the prince has, and his never-before-seen 750 animations, the biggest moveset of any 3D action-adventure game. But the team always knew that they wanted to keep the balance and realism, just like the original. We worked to achieve the same believable quality with the animation. Yes, the prince can perform some incredible superhuman moves, but we wanted those moves to look realistic, like they could actually happen. And it's not just a few moves. We developed an incredible array of movements that the prince uses to explore the palace, avoid traps, and fight enemies. Art director Alex Struan told Game Reactor. The team was also cautious of not taking much inspiration from the competition. While we played every major game that came out during our development phase, we avoided taking too much inspiration from them. Since we're doing something new with the Prince of Persia, we wanted to stay very fresh. Even though the young team led by DeSoleil had been creating a good game, Mallet still felt that their Prince of Persia game needed something more. Something that made it stand out. For a few months, they toyed with the idea of ladders being a crucial part of the gameplay, allowing players to kick and swirl them around like a Jackie Chan movie, but this idea was dropped. There was also another idea of using a magic carpet, and even a sequence where players fought enemies on top of a horse in a desert. We had a lot of great ideas, but we also wanted to focus the game design, says Mallet. We didn't want a ton of average stuff. We wanted a focused amount of great stuff. This is when the team decided to focus on the 3 core pillars of combat, acrobatics, and puzzle sequences, and what they thought could tie them all together. We needed our own technological breakthrough, or a gameplay keystone, Mallet says. Much like people talked about Jordan's animation system for the original Prince of Persia, we needed to raise the bar in some way with this game. And Mallet's creative director DeSoleil had the answer. And he owed everything to Donald Duck. See, when DeSoleil was creating Going Quackers, he had an idea he proposed to the producer. Let players rewind the game after they died because he hated restarting from the beginning. I remember playing the Donald Duck game, and when I died, I wanted to just go back in time a few seconds instead of having to replay the entire level, says DeSoleil. This was the golden idea Mallet had been waiting for. I think we all began to realize that by rewinding the game, the player would have a never-ending checkpoint, says Mallet. We also knew that a feature like that could become really important in an acrobatic game, where you're always making jumps and trying to avoid traps. Mallet just wasn't sure if this idea would even work on the Jade engine. Luckily for him, his lead programmer Claude Longuet knew that he could get it working, and the tiny Prince of Persia team of 8 had their first prototype ready. Mallet took the prototype to the Ubisoft executives in March of 2002, roughly 9 months into development. Nobody at this point besides the team had seen any footage of the game they had been working on. It might have been rough graphically, but it showed an absurd amount of promise. Lead level designer David Shatnoff, who was only 24 years old, was able to build test levels that highlighted the acrobatic gameplay possibilities that were fresh and innovative. It ran smoothly, the controls were easy, and the best part was Longue had the rewind feature working flawlessly. When the demo was finished, the executives were astonished, calling it the best first prototype they had ever seen. "This is so good you need to go into full-scale production today. Bring in 50 people immediately," one of them told Mallet. But Mallet, while happy, was also very worried. He did not want such a big team to come in so quickly. "We needed to finish the art style and find an art director. We needed to finalize the fight system. There were so many things we still had to do," Mallet said. In other words, the game simply wasn't ready for production. We needed at least 3 more months with the core team. But they weren't having it. They demanded Mallet leave pre-production that day. "I remember leaving the room and being furious, absolutely furious with the executives," explains Mallet. He firmly believed that a small team is the key to success in the beginning phase. By keeping the team small at the start, everyone develops a really strong working relationship, said Mallet. And he didn't want to start full production until the core team was happy. So instead of leaving feeling proud of their work, Mallet left worried that their early success might unravel right before him. Luckily for Mallet, he did finally convince the executives that they needed 3 more months of pre-production to fully grasp their vision. Leaving build-up for full scale would be delayed until summer of 2002. But Mallet did add one more person to the team after speaking to the executives, Raphael Lacoste, the art director they desperately needed. "We probably should have brought on an art director earlier," Mallet admitted. And once he was there, the team knew they needed to step away from the cartoon-like Aladdin world they had been building for the prince, because they knew a more mature look was what was needed. "Everyone just kept saying, more edgy, more mature," says Lacoste. "We started with bright and soft cartoon-like worlds, but over time, the game's art style took on a darker and more textured look, which was inspired by the work of French painters Jean-Léon Gérôme and David Roberts. We didn't want the game to look like a rigid polygon game, but rather it should feel like a painting you can play," Lacoste said. His influences on the game world shaped it into what it became, as he pushed to add more visual effects to the world like fog, streams of light, and more cloth that could sway in the wind, improving the visual quality immensely of the prototype. Around this time, Mechner came to visit the team in Montreal to check the progress they had made in the months since the deal had been struck. He was shown the prototype by Mallet and Soleil, which again blew Mechner away, especially the rewind feature. "It became a bit of a process of seduction," Mechner recalls. "I found myself interested in getting even more deeply involved with the game." So he offered to write the story and screenplay, with the focus of interweaving the rewind feature into the narrative, something the team had not really done yet. In fact, the original story the team developed for the game was in need of an overhaul. The original draft had 9 characters, including the prince, 2 love interests, 2 villains, and 2 helper characters, representing different political factions, and the setting of the prince's own palace home instead of in another kingdom. This story proved to be too difficult to work with, and with Mechner's offer to write the story himself was an easy decision for Mallet, and Mechner was officially hired as a writer for the game. While Mechner was going to write the story, it was the effort of the entire team that thought of the Sands of Time concept, a mystical power the prince unknowingly unleashes on his kingdom. The power would allow him to manipulate time, but it would also turn the inhabitants of medieval Persia into demonic creatures. Scrapping the original story and focusing on the Sands of Time concept now evolved them to craft a story that would create a more streamlined experience. The team now decided to focus their new direction on 4 concepts of gameplay. Unity of time and place. The story would take place over the course of a single day and night, all within the grounds of the Palace of Azad. Acrobatics. The prince's agility was seen as most of the fun, and if he was going to walk down hallways and open doors like a regular person, it would not be taking advantage of what makes him unique. So a destroyed palace was chosen as the backdrop, with collapsed staircases and buried passageways, forcing players to use their skills to find new ways to get from point A to point B, and then combat. The game's interface was going to be designed to fight or flight, not conversations. So the palace would be filled with enemies, but not humans, monsters. These monsters would be programmed to kill the prince no matter what, and the only option for players is to fight or run. And finally, rewind. Players would have to work for this ability to turn back time. It would not be given. The Sands of Time would function as a reward, something the players can collect, hoard, and spend when they needed it. What was created from these pillars was a story much easier to understand, with less characters involved. The hero would be eager to embark on a journey that demanded his courage and determination, but soon realizes that he gets way more than he bargained for, and his adventure turns into a life or death situation for him and everyone around him. It was important for Mechner and the team to show the prince evolve and change as the story goes on. He matures and learns what's really important. And as for the girl, Mechner explained, Farah is at once a love interest, an action sidekick, and the character who stands for what is good and right. As the only human survivor besides the villain, she becomes the prince's companion in adversity. Of course, the relationship is fraught with mistrust because she and the hero are both after the same thing, the dagger. In the original story, the Dagger of Time was an old family treasure. For the new story, it seemed more useful to make the Palace of Azad neutral ground, a place that both the prince and Farah would be encountering for the first time. So Mechner created a prologue in which the dagger and the Sands of Time are liberated by the prince's victorious army from a conquered Indian palace. The prologue then set up the entire game for the players. The player's first goal in the game would be to steal the dagger from the treasure vault, and the team made sure to model it after the tomb raiding sequence from Raiders of the Lost Ark, just like the original game 15 years earlier. It sets up the world of the game, the three main characters and what they want. It showcases the prince's character and abilities, a daredevil who races ahead of the attacking army in order to gain honor and glory, by being the first to steal a valuable trophy of war. It establishes the two main artifacts, the hourglass and the dagger, and explains how they come into the hero's possession. It offers the player a manageable environment in which to practice the prince's acrobatic and sword fighting abilities, Mechner explained. And finally, it lays the groundwork for the anti-war theme that underlies the whole story. The best bit about the story is that the prince actually causes his own struggles within the castle when he decides to help a guard with a puzzle. It's a long and challenging puzzle, and when he finally succeeds, what happens? A ghastly array of blades, slicers, and other traps spring out from the walls, causing the player to realize that A, the guard was probably insane, and B, now he has to spend the rest of the game evading these traps. Logically, it should make them want to rip the CD out of the drive, but as a game story twist, does it work? It seems to, Mechner explained to GameSpot. To push the storytelling to the max, the team and Mechner decided that the whole story would be a flashback, narrated by the hero in past tense. Two of my favorite Hollywood noir films, Double Indemnity and Sunset Boulevard, are narrated by a hero who is fatally wounded or dead. Knowing the story will end badly doesn't seem to harm the sense of empathy or suspense we feel along the way. I felt that by using film noir as a model for action-adventure video games set in 9th century Persia, we would be getting away with something, Mechner said. While it might sound easy, it took a lot of effort to make this effect happen. The narration had to work on two levels. It had to make sense for players on the first playthrough, but then at the same time, it had to make sense for players in retrospect, when players knew the prince was really telling the story and why. Then finding the right tone was crucial. Since the goal of the prince was to evolve, both in physical appearance, movements, and emotionally, the voice needed to be more mature than the gung-ho prince players meet in the beginning. The team did have some fun when implementing some of the voice lines throughout the game, and guidance clues, adding some humor to the game that they thought was an action-adventure one. But Mechner had other thoughts. By this point, it had become clear to us that although Prince of Persia was officially a swashbuckling acrobatic action-adventure, we were in fact making a game in the survival horror genre. Everything was running smoothly with development now at full scope, with the Prince of Persia team growing to over 55 people, all working in a giant war room together. This seems like it would be a bad idea, but the team found it to be very beneficial to their designs. In other companies, you build a level in isolation and only really talk to the producer, says David Shatnoff. Here, you can just call someone over to your monitor and say, hey, what do you think of this? If you're doing something cool, you might attract 10 or 15 people who will give you their feedback. And everything was running smoothly for the team up to this point. But in January of 2003, the start of some major issues would begin to show themselves to Mallet and his team. The Great Jade engine had finally met its match with the extensive graphical quality of Prince of Persia, and it couldn't handle rendering any of the levels anymore. The programming team came in and basically said, Yanis, we have some bad news. We need to create a totally new rendering system for the game, Mallet remembers. This blindsided him, and with a few months to go until their showing at E3, also worried him. Here we were only a few months before our debut to the public, and we no longer had a graphics engine. I definitely was getting worried. So Mallet got help from Ubisoft Shanghai's programmers, who created a 3D rendering engine that could fully handle and run the Sands of Time, making the game run faster than ever before, and more importantly, the visuals were greatly improved. This was a huge boost for the devs, but with E3 approaching, the young team members became increasingly worried, as prior booth shows from Montreal were basically ignored and were used as a resting spot for other attendees. The only guys who came to our booth before, explained Druin, were the people looking for somewhere to rest, because there was a place to sit down near the Donald Duck game. Luckily, Mechner was an E3 vet and knew their work was great, and he had to keep reminding them. I kept saying your work is top quality, he would explain, but I don't think anyone on the team emotionally believed what I was telling them. But Mechner's positivity proved to be right, as when the Prince of Persia team showed up to E3, they had an entire section for the Sands of Time to show off their new demo. I went to E3 expecting we were going to have this little stand in the back, remembers Richard Dumas. Then I walked into the booth and saw we had a whole section for Prince of Persia. There were Prince of Persia booth babes. Things were definitely looking up. After the hard work everyone put into creating the Sands of Time, the young devs were looking for any kind of validation at the show. Their work did not go unnoticed. Attendees filled their booth trying to elbow their way through the line for a chance to play their game. It was just what they were looking for. I remember turning to Patrice at one point and saying, "Is it always like this at E3? Remembers Dumas? And he just said to me, "No way, man. It has never been like this before." It's so awesome. E3 would conclude with the Sands of Time creating a ton of buzz and would win E3's Best Action-Adventure Game of the Year. For their success, Mallet gave everyone a week off after E3, but when they returned, the mood went from excitement to gloomy. The executives told Mallet that the game had to be ready by the holiday, which was only 6 months away. I basically realized after E3 there was no way we could finish the game this year, and we'd have to slip it to 2004, explained Mechner. The team saw this portion of the development as the darkest hour. It was a make-or-break moment. The whole game could have easily come crashing down, Mechner remembered, who actually moved to Montreal to help finish development. Mallet knew the stakes were high and he had to be honest with his team. We came back and I told them, okay, we have a good demo, and that's all we have right now. The scope of the game at this time was still very ambitious, and at their current rate, a delay might be necessary. Everyone knew who we were after E3, so why couldn't we just take some extra time and come out next year, Desolé said. But anxiety began to hit the entire team at this point, knowing that they were not going to delay it. Okay, these guys had a lot of fears, Mallet said. I think it's because they felt so close to creating a masterpiece, it was going to be their first taste of success. So they really didn't want to mess it up right at the end. To get ahead of schedule, it was decided that the game was going to be cut down by at least 15%. Every morning we had to come in and say, okay, the time for dreaming is past. The time for basking in the glory of E3 reaction is over, recalls Mechner. I always knew that the game would have to be cut back at some point. It definitely was too large. But of course, it's never easy to figure out what gets cut. But the team figured out some ideas. They would first cut all the levels that were either still in early development or not up to the high quality they were looking for. And one of the biggest cuts and one that hurt the team the most was cutting a series of boss fights with a creature named the Griffin, which appeared to be similar to the Shadow Man concept. You're going to have these 3 encounters with him throughout the game, reveals Desolé. The first 2 times you wouldn't have a good enough sword to beat him, but at the end you finally get him. While these cuts at the time were quite hard to make, the game was better off for it. We were always very realistic about what we could and couldn't do, Mallet suggested. The project was ultimately better off because we didn't try to cram a bunch of average stuff into the game. Everything that's in there now is AAA quality. The last 2 months of development saw the team working solely fixing the 13,000 bugs that had remained in the game. It's amazing it has all come down to that, Mallet remembered. Some of the obscure bugs saw Farah, the computer-controlled sidekick, forget what she had to do in a level if a player goes back and forth between 2 levels without killing any enemies. And with the team finally fixing those 13,000 bugs, all they had to do was wait and see if their game passed inspection. Your fate is in the hands of the console company, so you can't really do anything. You just wonder, will they approve it? Will they find any bugs? There are a lot of unknowns, Mechner remembered. But Mechner had one thing he wanted to say to the fans before the release. As a gamer, I want to be touched by a complete artistic experience, not just a commercial product. I want to feel that the game developers really have something to tell me, that I discover their personal vision when I complete the game. Elegance, attention to detail, unity in the story, and game design are important things. If I don't notice these, I quickly lose interest. That's why I hope that all gamers, both casual and hardcore, see and appreciate these qualities in Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, he said to Xbox World. And on the day of October 15th, the game officially went gold, and Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time launched to critical acclaim on November 11th of 2003, receiving positive reviews for just about everything. But oddly enough, sales in North America started very low and were quite worrying for the team. They had only sold 270,000 copies by all consoles at the end of the year. It was believed that the numbers were so low because of the simultaneous launch of Beyond Good and Evil. Ubisoft's answer to this problem was to offer other Ubisoft games for free with a purchase of The Sands of Time, and this gave the game the boost it needed. The Sands of Time went on to sell over 2 million copies by the beginning of 2004, with 1 million of those coming from Europe. The game has gone on to sell over more than 14 million copies worldwide as of 2014. The team's hard work, which saw them working on an average of 16 hours per day and sometimes peaking at 20 to 48 consecutive, saw their game win multiple awards. It won Outstanding Innovation in Computer Gaming, as well as Outstanding Achievement in Animation, Game Design, Gameplay Engineering, and visual engineering. And it seemed Mechner knew they had something special from the beginning. This was one of those rare cases where a great team and an exceptional idea came together to create something that's incredibly good. It was a young team, packed with talent and enthusiasm. If you're now wondering how Prince of Persia and all its success ruined Ubisoft, it didn't. At least not directly. It was merely the first domino in a very long line of choices and experiences made by Ubisoft. See, the huge success of The Sands of Time prompted Ubisoft's executives to instantly greenlight a sequel. And with 2 huge games now in their portfolio, Splinter Cell being the other, they weren't gonna miss a chance at more profits. So they went back to creative director Patrice Désilets to make their sequel, only he wouldn't. Instead, Désilets took another path. He was done with the Prince character, finding the idea too boring and predictable. So he began reading through books for inspiration, and he found one in particular that spoke of assassins. Désilets told his superiors he wasn't gonna make another Prince of Persia game after that, because he had an idea for his own new IP, Assassin's Creed. His franchise turned into a billion-dollar machine over the years, allowing Ubisoft to start their insane microtransaction ideas, and inspired what gamers call the Ubisoft formula. I recommend watching this video here about the fall of Assassin's Creed, where we go through the history of each game, and how Ubisoft took it all away from Désilets and turned it into their money-making franchise.